Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. On June 25, 2025, Bergeson and Campbell, along with the Environmental Law Institute and the George Washington University Milken Institute of Public Health, sponsored an all-day virtual conference titled TSCA Reform 9 Years Later. The conference was hugely successful, and almost 1,000 people registered for it. The quality of the discussion, the caliber of the participants, and the timeliness of the content motivated us to repurpose the substantive sessions to enable our podcast audience to listen to the sessions in this venue. Our topic in this podcast is the Toxic Substances Control Act, Plastics Production, Use, and Recycling, Key TSCA Considerations. This includes an overview of the plastics waste crises, EPA's regulation of plastic chemicals under TSCA, EPA's approach to the regulation of plastic waste as a chemical feedstock, and much more. Now, here's the panel discussion on plastics production, use, and recycling, key TSCA considerations from TSCA Reform 9 years later.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon or good morning if you're on the West Coast, and thank you for joining this conference. This discussion on plastics will cover whether and how the Toxic Substances Control Act has been used by EPA in connection with the environmental impact, production, uses, and alternatives to plastics, and how it might do so in the future. Key areas for consideration include the chemicals used in plastics, their fate and transport, effects on human health and the environment, and end-of-life considerations such as degradability, recycling, waste-to-energy processes, and microplastics. How plastics have been historically regulated by EPA under TSCA and the changes ahead will be examined in this next hour. And with us today are some of the country's leading experts on TSCA, as well as being experts in the use of plastics and their human health and environmental impacts. First of all, I'd like to introduce Ross Eisenberg, president of American Plastic Makers, a self-funded group of 19 American Chemistry Council Plastic Division members. Ross leads ACC's plastic advocacy at the state, federal, and global levels, working across party lines to achieve a circular and sustainable solution for plastics in society. We also have with us today Eve Gartner. Eve is director of cross-cutting toxic strategies at Earth Justice. And in that capacity, Eve works with Earth Justice's offices and program teams to design and effectuate cross-organizational legal strategies to address federal and state regulatory failures that have resulted in serious harms from toxic substances and pollution, with a particular focus on lead, PFAS, and plastics. So Eve is our lawyer on this panel, in addition to myself, but I'm being a moderator today. We also have with us today Jessie Neeland. Jessie is a principal scientist with Gradient. She helps companies understand potential environmental impacts of new chemicals. Prior to joining Gradient, Dr. Neeland taught environmental chemistry, and her background there and her continued profession in her professional capacity, she helps companies discern different sources of chemicals in the environment. And then we also have with us Renee Sharp, and Renee is our West Coast representative today. Renee is Director of Plastics and Petrochemical Advocacy, Environmental Health at the NRDC. She specializes in plastic pollution, environmental health, and clean energy. Before being at NRDC, Renee spent several years at the Environmental Working Group in multiple leadership positions, and also was a strategic advisor for the National Environmental Health Work Safer States. Renee holds a bachelor's degree from Rice University and a master's degree in biology from Pennsylvania State University. Thank you all for joining us today. And at this time, each of our panelists will provide some introductory remarks to lead into the discussion and questions that we've designed together to explore TSCA's regulation of plastics. Ross, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right.
Oh, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jesse first. Sorry.
Fair enough.
My apologies.
Surprise.
Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Martha. Yeah, we've heard in panels this morning about how risk assessments for new and existing chemicals are done under TSCA. So I wanted to start as the chemist in the room to talk about how plastics are a bit different from the assessment of other chemicals. We all know what plastics are in a sense. We interact with plastics every day, often as finished articles. But because TSCA generally addresses chemicals or materials at the level of the individual chemical substance, it's helpful to think about what chemical substances are present in plastics to understand how those might be considered in risk assessments under TSCA. So in essence, the primary substance in each plastic material is a polymer, meaning a large molecule built up of many individual chemical building blocks called monomers. Polyethylene is a polymer made with ethylene monomers, for example. In addition to that polymer, plastics also contain specific chemical additives, including plasticizers and dyes. The finished plastic material may also have residual monomers and impurities present in it that can contribute to the risk profile. By their very nature, plastic materials have some variability in their composition, and the name of the polymer itself doesn't give you enough information to really know all of the chemical substances and impurities that may be present and relevant. So for that reason, risk assessment for polymers is a bit more complicated than for simple molecules. Often, the risk assessment really does focus on those residual monomers and impurities, partly because these are smaller molecules that might leach out. They might be more bioavailable and might be more mobile in the environment than the large polymer molecule itself. And so for that reason, those are often the focus of a risk assessment for any polymer, and including under TSCA. Again, since TSCA takes this chemical by chemical approach, the monomers that are used to manufacture those polymer materials also could be the subject of their own risk assessment or evaluation. And so we've seen some polymer monomers and some plasticizers that are already being considered and proposed as high priority for risk evaluation under Section 6 of TSCA. We'll, I think, talk about those later in the panel. And, depending on which material it is, their use in the manufacture of plastic materials may be just one of many conditions of use that are considered in that overall risk evaluation process. Also under Section 5 of TSCA, any new polymers or new chemicals being manufactured or imported for the first time have to be reviewed by EPA. And in that sense, plastic materials are no different from any other chemical. One particular feature, at least for polymers, is that there does exist a polymer exemption under TSCA. The concept here is that those polymer molecules are expected to be large enough, stable enough, and generally chemically inert compared to other chemical materials. And so as a result, they are less likely to pose significant risk to human health or the environment. I'll note that many polymers do not meet the strict criteria for the TSCA polymer exemption, and we may talk a little more about that later. Finally, I think we can all acknowledge there are some unique end-of-life considerations for plastics. Recycling of plastics, whether it's the traditional mechanical recycling or advanced chemical recycling, may create new exposures or new chemical substances that have to be considered and evaluated in their own right. So the property of those substances may often depend quite a lot on the plastic feedstock that is being recycled. It may depend quite a lot on the impurities that are present in those materials. And finally, I think we've all seen a growing concern about microplastics, microplastic particles or fibers that may be generated as plastic materials degrade in the environment. And so that is a consideration particular to plastics as opposed to any other kind of chemical material. So I look forward to hearing the perspectives from the other panel members, and I'm happy to be participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, for kicking it off. Appreciate those remarks. Renee, would you please go next?
Sure, great to be here. Well, since we just got a great overview of the scientific kind of perspective on plastics and chemicals under TSCA, and I think we're going to hear from Eve the legal. I thought I would give, for my introductory comments, some background on the plastics crisis in general, which obviously intersects with TSCA in very significant ways, but it's also much broader. So plastics contribute to toxic pollution throughout their life cycle. Global annual production of plastic has increased exponentially over the past 65 years, growing from 2 million metric tons in 1950 to 460 million metric tons in 2019. Much of this plastic quickly becomes waste, and plastic waste is found everywhere, including in the farthest reaches of the Arctic, the deep seabed, even in the clouds and the atmosphere. Plastic pollution has been linked from everything from infertility and cancer in humans to severe injury and death in wildlife. Frontline communities are being particularly impacted by toxic air and water pollutants emitted by plastic production and disposal facilities. Plastics can release harmful compounds into our air, food, water, and the environment, both during everyday use and at the end of their life. The thousands of chemicals used to make different kinds of plastics include carcinogens, hormone disruptors, obesity-causing compounds, and substances that can cause harm to the liver, brain, kidneys, and the cardiovascular, immune, and reproductive systems. Manufacturing plastic products also use thousands of chemicals that have not been sufficiently tested for safety. In 2023, the United Nations Environmental Program compiled data from 2 recent studies and found that more than 13,000 chemicals are used to make plastic. This review found that 1/4 of them are considered to be of moderate to very high concern owing to their links to cancer, developmental harm, hormone disruption, and other health effects. And in 2024, researchers from Norway and Switzerland compiled an even more extensive database and found that over 16,000 chemicals are potentially used or present in plastic. Of this number, over 4,200 were found to be chemicals of concern due to their high hazard for human health and the environment. And they also found that over 10,000 of these chemicals lack hazard information, which obviously is essential for ensuring proper assessment and management of these chemicals. During production, transportation, use, recycling, disposal, and when leaked into the environment, plastics shed and break down into microplastics, which of course are tiny pieces of plastic that are less than 5 millimeters long. Microplastics have been found to pose digestive, reproductive, and respiratory hazards in mice, and are suspected to cause similar hazards in humans. They have been found in the heart, lungs, organs, breast milk, placenta, stool, and blood of humans. Plants can absorb microplastics through their roots, and these tiny plastic particles are also contaminating our foods. They can also change the composition of the critical soil microorganisms that underpin many food webs. And they can also absorb toxic chemicals already in the environment, leading to the accumulation of toxic contaminants in the tissues of organisms. And the UN Environmental Program has estimated that there are 51 trillion microplastic particles in the ocean alone, which is 500 times more than stars in our galaxy. Plastic pollution is largely irreversible. It's too widespread, of course, and diffuse to realistically clean up, and it's simply not possible to remove such contaminants from the blood and tissues of billions of organisms. There is a global toxicity debt that scientists recognize associated with plastic pollution, because even if we stop producing and using plastics today, the related toxicity could still increase in the future because it can take decades for some discarded plastics to break down into microplastics and release the toxic chemicals they contain into the environment. And then we come to questions of disposal. After largely misleading the public about the recyclability of plastics for decades, the plastic industry has been doubling down on its misleading recycling claims and promoting so-called chemical recycling, which is often incineration and can also involve the use of highly toxic solvents. There's many names for this set of technologies. But the truth is that these approaches largely fail to recycle plastics and are instead often used to produce toxic plastic waste-derived fuels. And their expanded use will only lead to more toxic pollution of our air and water and more plastic waste sent to landfills and incinerators. So we'll never put an end to the plastic waste crisis without reducing the amount of plastic and toxic additives we put in the world. And we believe that we should start immediately phasing out the production and use of the most hazardous plastic polymers, chemical additives, and types of plastic products, and also those that are necessary. And it's really against this larger backdrop that we're here to discuss how TSCA is or is not fully addressing the toxic hazards posed by plastics, the chemical concern that they contain, and the microplastics they shed, because these issues are becoming more and more pressing every day. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Renee, for starting to frame up the debate. And Ross, it is now your turn in the lineup to go.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me today on this TSCA panel. Glad that good to hear Renee come out swinging. I am the lone industry rep on this thing, so I will be, I think, largely providing the role of fact checker / punching bag. But I want to take it up one level and just basically start with TSCA, right? So I was working at a different association, but I was there 9 years ago when the Lautenberg Act was enacted. But even before that, one moment from the old TSCA reform campaign is just going to stick with me forever. I remember sitting upstairs in the ACC conference room, literally upstairs from where I'm sitting right now, about 12 years ago. And my predecessors at the association announced that Senators Vitter, Lautenberg, Gillibrand, and Crapo had forged a compromise that kicked off what would ultimately, a couple of years later, become the Lautenberg Act. I remember sitting there at that time and thinking, oh my God, they might actually pull this thing off. It frankly upended everything that I'd been taught to think about the impossibility of amending a bedrock environmental statute in today's Congress. It made me look at lobbying differently. And frankly, when ACC came calling a couple years later and asked me in 2020 to join ACC and our government affairs team, it made the decision a pretty easy one. It's that same calculus that brought me 2 years ago to this current job leading ACC's plastics division. Much like TSCA, I see an opportunity to do something big and bipartisan and meaningful to fix the problem of plastic waste entering the environment. I look at my members who view change not as as something to say no to, but as an opportunity to innovate, and who are committed to doing what it takes to solve this problem. And I come to work, as does my whole division here, every day with the goal of moving us closer to that policy, a policy like TSCA that we can all look back on and say, hey, we made a difference here. We actually solved this problem. Now, as I said, I represent plastics manufacturers in the plastics value chain. It would be malpractice for me not to talk a little bit about that. Plastic manufacturing plays a pivotal role in the U.S. economy, serving as the cornerstone of several key industries. Plastics' versatility, durability, and affordability make them the material of choice in many manufacturing, packaging, and construction applications. On the economic side, the plastics industry generates more than 1 million jobs, enhances the nation's economic resilience and competitiveness. Plastic products support more than 26% of U.S. manufacturing. We export about $68 billion in plastic materials and products globally. So in this world of sort of daily trade crises, we actually have a more than $20 billion trade surplus when it comes to plastics, which is a real strength for us. And then on the recycling side, we've announced more than $11 billion in investments in U.S. recycling since 2017. Plastics are efficient materials that allow us to do more with less. Modern life truly relies on plastics, whether it's life-saving medical devices, packaging that keeps medical instruments sterile, lightweight vehicles, and the safety devices in them like seatbelts and airbags, building and construction like spray foam insulation, pipes, siding, deck materials, solar panels, wind turbines in the renewable energy space, and then for food packaging, which reduces food waste and protects from pathogens and contaminants. Now, the chemicals in plastics, and that is what we're here to talk about, is the chemicals in the plastics. They typically are there to improve the function and the durability of plastics. So they retain their integrity when they're exposed to elements like renewable energy infrastructure when it's out in the sun, or extreme heat, like during medical sterilization. And so those things are there for a reason. As we'll discuss today, EPA is regulating several of the monomers and chemical additives that become plastics. AC supports TSCA, as I said earlier, and we're engaging constructively with the agency as it proceeds with all those regulatory initiatives. You're going to hear a lot more about TSCA from our TSCA lead, Dr. Kimberly White, on a panel in a few hours at the end of the day. But it's not really going to surprise you that my take on TSCA as it applies to plastics is pretty consistent with the ACC's overall approach to TSCA writ large. So like our counterparts on the chemical side of the house, we are pretty frustrated with the backlog of chemicals under review at EPA. 9 out of 10 new chemicals under TSCA review are delayed, with approval time stretching all the way up to as much as 6 years, which is far longer than the 3 to 6 months seen in other nations. This glacial pace stifles innovation and forces companies to look overseas to bring new technologies to market. And that's not just us saying that. Those are the companies in our membership actually telling us that. Regulatory uncertainty and barriers are driving the development of new chemicals outside the US and Europe or Asia, because those regulatory systems actually wind up being more predictable and timelier. And so, like I said, our member companies have reported developing chemicals in other countries as a result of the problems with TSCA. And that's a challenge, right? That's a real problem, because often when you're bringing new chemicals to market, new products to market, they're typically safer, more sustainable. They're the better version of that product with better environmental performance. And so if we can't get those innovative products and materials to market efficiently and safely, then our companies are going to be forced to look elsewhere. And that means losing not just domestic manufacturing, but often the downstream industries that rely on it. On the existing chemical side, we're pretty alarmed with the trend toward banning certain chemistries, even when it can be demonstrated that those chemistries can be manufactured or used safely, or in the alternative, regulating to such a low level that it results in a de facto ban. A number of these chemistries are often critical to our national security and our economy. We need them to manufacture semiconductors, automobiles, military equipment, things like that here in the US to protect our supply chain. With respect to plastics, this also winds up being a pretty important concern, because there's sometimes no acceptable alternatives, or even worse, you wind up with regrettable substitution, where you're bringing something in that actually performs worse for the environment than the material that you're taking out. We saw this live during the Biden administration with the proposed neuron pyrolysis using plastic feedstocks. One of the many things that I think were a challenge with that rule was it insisted that the pyrolysis oil that came out the other end have absolute zero quantities of a laundry list of chemicals. Literally just pulled off a list of chemicals that people don't like, with no de minimis threshold whatsoever. And this threw significant regulatory uncertainty into the market for new chemical recycling plants. I saw it from our members. And it threw off the growth curve for that industry, an industry that we think is really important as we're going to actually solve the plastic waste crisis. So bottom line for us, when EPA reviews chemicals, TSCA risk evaluations need to be risk-based and appropriately scoped. They must rely on the best available science and weight of the scientific evidence and recognize the use of PPE. In addition, risk management actions should be risk-based and based on the chemical's actual condition of use and real-world exposure. That was the intent behind TSCA. We continue to believe in it. I think I'll stop there. I really do look forward to the discussion today, and thank you guys for having me on the panel.
Right. Thank you, Ross. Eve, you also had significant experience around Lautenberg's enactment and the implementation and litigation that's happened since then. Please close out our introductory remarks with some insights from that experience.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks to the rest of you for those great openings. As the lawyer, I and somebody, as Martha just said, who follows EPA's actions under TSCA closely, I thought I would just share, from a legal perspective, a brief overview of what's been happening with respect to plastics under TSCA, including the litigation that has been filed and is some of which is still pending. So I think Ross kind of alluded to this just at the end there, but a few years ago, EPA approved 18 new chemicals that are derived from plastic waste, and in particular derived from oils resulting from pyrolysis, which is a type of incineration of plastic. And Chevron, which is the company that sought approval of those waste plastic chemicals, intended to produce millions of tons of those substances every year at its Pascagoula refinery. EPA approved those chemicals without requiring any limits on their release into air or water, even though EPA's own assessment showed that the cancer risks from those chemicals were as much as 250,000 times higher than the benchmark that it consistently finds unacceptable under TSCA. In fact, under EPA's own analysis, one of those 18 substances, for that substance, 1 out of 4 people exposed over a lifetime could get cancer. And the other chemicals also had significant cancer risks and non-cancer risks as well. I'm going to talk about the litigation over this, but I also just take a step back to say, I think this, really highlights, one of the overarching concerns about plastics, which is that we don't know what to do with them at the end of life, right? I mean, that's just a gigantic question. And, Renee talked about that, Jesse talked about that. They don't break down. And so, I do think that the plastic industry is looking for something to do with them. So they're, burning them, making these, using this pyrolysis technique and other kinds of end-of-life techniques. And then that results in these products at the end, these waste products, and then they're trying to use them to make other chemicals. And it's not really surprising that those chemicals end up having very significant risks attached. And it's just part of the big problem. Like, what do we do with these plastics at the end of life? But with respect to these 18 chemicals made from plastic waste, a group that's a community group near the Pascagoula refinery, Cherokee Concerned Citizens, filed a petition to review EPA's Section 5E order for these waste plastic chemicals. So the 5E order was an order that EPA is required to issue under Section 5E when it doesn't have adequate information to conclude that the chemicals are not likely to present unreasonable risk. TSCA requires it to impose conditions on the conditions of use, manufacture, use, and disposal. But the 5E order for these Chevron chemicals didn't have any limits on release into air or water, despite these phenomenally high risks. As a result of that litigation, EPA late last year, late in 2024, withdrew the 5E order and withdrew the approvals, and the litigation has now been dismissed. However, the underlying are still pending, and EPA has said that it intends to re-review them. If EPA approves the PMNs again and does not impose the strict limits on release during the production and use of those chemicals, it's, I think, inevitable that new litigation could be filed. I should also note that those Chevron waste plastic chemicals aren't unique. We're aware of other PMNs for other chemicals and fuels that would be made with substances created through this that are pending before the agency. And there may well be others as well, but because the PMN process is so opaque and non-transparent, as was discussed in the new chemicals panel earlier today, we sometimes don't know whether the chemicals are being made with plastic waste. And then, as Ross also alluded to, one issue that surfaced in connection with these Chevron waste plastic chemicals was that the oils that are the pyrolysis oils contain toxic impurities or byproducts that are remnants of the plastic feedstock material. These waste plastic streams that go into the pyrolysis process are often really complex mixtures of different types of plastics. It's been estimated that the pyrolysis stream could contain up to 1,000 different chemicals. And then the impurities from incinerating this complex stream of plastics can include known toxic substances like PFAS, phthalates, flame retardants, dioxins, furans. With the 18 Chevron chemicals, they didn't identify those impurities in the PMN, even though they have a legal obligation to do that. But that issue kind of came up as part of the controversy around those approvals. And then EPA, acknowledging that there was a concern, proposed this significant new use rule, or SNUR, that Ross alluded to, that would have required that a SNUN, a significant new use notice, be issued if the manufacturing or processing would include any of these known really toxic chemicals. But that SNUR was never finalized because the approval of those chemicals was withdrawn. So that's what I wanted to share in the new chemicals context. Turning now quickly to the existing chemicals context, I think others have alluded to this, and we'll talk about it later, but EPA is in the process of conducting a risk evaluation for the really important plastic monomer vinyl chloride, which is a building block for PVC plastic. It's also considering whether to designate as a high priority substance the monomer styrene, which is used as a building block for polystyrene. EPA is also quite far along in the Section 6 process for several plastic additives. In particular, it has finalized risk evaluations for several phthalates chemicals. Phthalates are petrochemical plasticizers that are linked to a host of health problems, including male reproductive toxicity, and for some of them, cancer. And the EPA is also in the process of conducting risk evaluations for several other phthalates. A total of 7 phthalates are going through this risk evaluation, risk management process. And I think one really notable thing has been that EPA is considering the cumulative risk of phthalate exposure for 6 of the phthalates that are undergoing review using the common endpoint of male reproductive toxicity. So I think that's a really interesting scientific development. I should note that environmental health groups have been very critical of EPA's approach to the phthalate risk evaluations, as well as the risk evaluations of the flame retardant additives that are also going through the risk evaluation process. I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but one of the concerns has been that EPA isn't aggregating exposures to the chemicals from multiple sources and conditions of use, even though people are exposed to these chemicals that are released from plastics and from lots that are released from plastics, these plastic additives. The exposure is occurring from lots of different sources because we're using plastic, as Ross alluded to, we're using plastic in lots of different ways throughout the day. And so there are aggregate exposures. And I just flagged that another key concern is that EPA has not been considering exposure to microplastics as it's looking at the risks from phthalates and flame retardants, even though people are exposed to these chemical substances during the degradation of the plastic during use and also during disposal. And those microplastics do contain these additives in them. So that's an exposure pathway that EPA hasn't been focused on. So two litigations I wanted to mention. One involves a risk management rule for the persistent bioaccumulative and toxic flame retardant that's called DECA-BDE, which was used extensively in plastics and especially electronics. The rule that EPA adopted bans or phases out most uses of DECA-BDE, but it allows the continued use of plastic containing DECA-BDE if the plastic is recycled and used to make new products. There's a lot of concern about that because the DECA-BDE can persist in the plastic through multiple rounds of recycling. And then this recycled plastic can be used to make kitchen utensils, children's toys, food packaging. And that's a concern because DECA-BDE is linked to cancer, reproductive health harms, and other serious health harms. People might have paid attention last year. There was a flurry of media attention to concerns about black plastic, and which is almost always recycled plastic. It's used in kitchenware and food contact materials, and there were a lot of attention paid to these reports about the presence of toxic chemicals in black plastic. And most of that black plastic contained this DECA-BDE flame retardant. So the Yurok tribe and several organizations have challenged aspects of the DECA-BDE risk management rule, including the decision to allow plastic containing DECA-BDE to be recycled into new products. That case is pending in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and again highlights the same concern I flagged before, that we don't know what to do with plastic at the end of its life. Recycling sounds good, but it's not good to recycle carcinogens into our kids' toys and our kitchen spatulas and our the trays that our sushi comes on. And then the other case that I wanted to mention is a case involving the fluorination of plastic containers. So there's a company that uses a process that fluorinates plastic containers, and that results in the formation of PFOA and other PFAS that can then contaminate the contents of the container. Folks who joined this webinar last year might recall that We talked about the fact that in March of 2024, the Fifth Circuit invalidated orders that were issued by EPA that prohibited use of this plastic fluorination process. The Fifth Circuit ruling didn't cast doubt on EPA's determination that the fluorination process resulted in unreasonable risks, but it did say that this enforcement of a SNR wasn't the proper TSCA tool for effectuating that result. Since that ruling a little over a year ago, there have been a couple developments. First, last April, several organizations filed a TSCA Section 21 petition seeking a Section 6 rule banning the fluorination of plastics, and EPA granted that petition in July 2024. In September of 2024, the agency requested information about fluorinated containers, but it has taken no action since then. However, another thing happened, which is that another set of organizations filed a lawsuit in July of 2024, asserting that EPA had a duty under Section 4F of TSCA to prevent or reduce the risks from fluorination of plastics. Section 4F is a little known, little used provision of TSCA that requires EPA to take action to prevent or reduce significant risk of serious or widespread harm once it has a reasonable basis to conclude that such a risk is present. That case was dismissed by the district court in DC on the basis that it was moot in light of EPA's decision to grant the Section 21 petition on the fluorination of plastics. However, the groups that filed that case have appealed that, and it's now pending in the DC circuit. And I just want to make one other legal note. I know I'm somewhat past my time here, but just as the lawyer, I appreciate, Jesse, your observation that regulation of plastics is, maybe different than other chemicals, and noting that, plastics are these sort of complex mixtures of polymers and additives. But I did want to note that under TSCA, EPA has the authority to take any action that it could take with respect to a single chemical. It can act with respect to a category of chemicals. And TSCA defines the term category extremely broadly. So EPA could indeed decide that groups of chemicals, any group of chemicals that relates to plastics is a category. It could even decide that all of the chemicals in a particular plastic polymer are themselves a category, and then it could, take any action with respect to that category. So looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Right. Well, no, that's an excellent segue. Thank you, Eve, for giving everybody that overview of all the activities that are going on. And it's a really excellent segue into our first question. We're going to start with some questions on existing chemicals, move into new chemicals, and give those equal time. The question is, these questions are really going to try to ground plastics within the current framework that we have for TSCA now at 9 years old. So what are the unique challenges of assessing the risks of plastics and plastic-related products under the procedures of TSCA as we have them right now? I think some of you touched upon it a little bit, that TSCA is a chemical by chemical evaluation, and Renee, you mentioned just the sheer number of chemicals that might be involved here. Do you think TSCA procedurally is able to handle plastics under the statute?
I mean, I'll just start off by saying, when we're thinking about the vast, the vast numbers of chemicals that are used in the production of plastics, and we recognize that so many chemicals were grandfathered in and really haven't been assessed for safety. And under the revised TSCA, there's there's definitely progress being made in reviewing more chemicals more quickly. But even with the timelines of of our updated law, I should have done the math, to figure out how many years, decades, centuries perhaps it would take to actually review all these chemicals. So I think just there alone, I think that there's some real structural problems with really having TSCA have the ability to really evaluate all these chemicals that are in plastics and do the assessments aside from other concerns that we have about the way the assessments are being done, as Eve's touched on.
Eve, Russ, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, now I have to lower my hand. So, sorry, that's new technology for me. So on the UNEP 13,000 chemicals thing, so those numbers are not necessarily fact. There's, there've been a number of studies since then have suggested the actual number of chemicals going to plastics are much lower. Regardless, one of the things we've done, we the global chemical industry, as part of the global treaty negotiations, have put forth an additives database so that essentially everybody everywhere can see what those chemicals are that go into plastics and how they're regulated and what the risk profiles are and kind of all of those things. With respect to TSCA specifically, TSCA should work, right? Again, we believe in TSCA. TSCA should work. You're seeing a lot, plastics, the polymers are included as conditions of use in the scope for the monomer, right? So whether it's, vinyl chloride has PVC as with, PVC resin manufacturing as within the scope of it. DIMP, DIDP, these were things that, the end polymer manufacturing and, was considered within the scope of the monomer itself. So, or within the additive itself. So it should work for that. And obviously there's a lot of them, but realistically, TSCA can work in that respect.
I think I'll share a couple thoughts on this. One thing that I think is that, plastics, as I said several times, I think one of the big challenges with plastics is the end of life, right? And I think that TSCA, the TSCA identifies 5 conditions of use: manufacturing, processing, use, distribution and commerce, and disposal. And I think over the years, TSCA has worked the least well in regulating and managing the risks during the disposal phase. And I don't think I think part of the problem here is we don't really have great answers for how to dispose of plastics. And I think this case involving the pyrolysis oils and then the impurities, just really underscores that we don't have a good answer. So, EPA can only, manage risks using existing technologies. And it's not really clear that we have effective technologies that don't involve unreasonable risk for dealing with plastic. And relatedly, I would say, I think that TSCA has also worked the best, and this is not really written into the statute, but just as a practical matter, when there are safer alternatives in the pipeline or in existence, right? That's when, because as Ross, you were saying, and the regulated industry always says that the products they're making are essential, that they're essential to national security, they're essential to, electronics, and I don't know enough to disagree with that, but I do think that it's hard to argue. It's hard for anyone to argue against that, and so we really do need to develop safer alternatives. And when we have safer alternatives, it's much easier for an agency to say the risks of this are unreasonable and too great, and it should be phased out over whatever is a reasonable time frame. But I'm not sure that we really have that, as many alternatives to some of these plastics uses in the pipeline as we need. And the industry keeps saying that plastic is safe, but all the evidence is that that if you look at the whole life cycle of plastic, and the American public agrees that it's not sustainable to keep making and using plastic.
So can I follow up on it? So excellent points. I want to jump in on the end of life thing. So show of hands, just real quickly among this panel, who has visited a chemical recycling facility? Exactly. So we do think there are solutions here. As somebody who has seen it and and can tell you what it is not nearly as charged or as scary or any of those things as I think many of the people who use some of that language think. That is a solution here. It should absolutely be regulated. There's never really a dispute here. And frankly, our issue with the SNUR was more along some of the sort of the market impacts of the SNUR, and frankly, that the SNUR may not be the right thing for that, particularly in light of the enhanced case. But realistically, if you want to actually, I mean, we think that is a solution for a lot of this stuff. So you don't necessarily have to start with there is no end of life solution for, frankly, the chemicals that can't be mechanically recycled, because there absolutely is. It's being done, right? I mean, I've seen it. So my job is to help scale that up and create market conditions where they can compete. But we sort of wound up in an argument where you sort of start with, well, there is no solution, so we have to have alternatives. Well, there is a solution, and we should, and it should be regulated, and TSCA has a place in that. But like we should go back to that too.
Renee?
I just want to say that I have not visited a chemical recycling plant. There's not very many of them, but I have looked at some of the data that we do have on some of those facilities. And just to kind of put things in perspective, just 3 pyrolysis facilities generated more than 2 million pounds of hazardous waste in less than 4 years. And they also have emitted hazardous air pollutants. And also the non-pyrolysis facilities also, use toxic solvents. So, the plastic has a toxic life cycle, and with chemical recycling, and from our perspective, and based on the data that we're seeing, that's not making plastic less toxic. It's really actually just like adding to the toxicity of the whole life cycle. So we don't think it's a good solution. And mechanical recycling has its own issues as well, as Eve noted. If we have toxic chemicals in the plastic and you're recycling the plastic, then you're recycling the toxic chemicals into new plastic. So not to say that there are problems there, but chemical recycling introduces new toxic hazards that we're very concerned about.
Was that, so I haven't seen the hazardous waste data. Was that plastic to plastic facilities, or was that plastic to fuel or something else? Was that like tires to fuel or something like that? I'm just curious which ones those were.
I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link to our report where we detail that.
All right.
So small that it's just, I mean, they're literally, it's like the chicken bones that come off the waste. Like that's what's burning up, right? I mean, we're not talking about one in Atlanta that I visited recently, like it's literally next to a Great American Cookie Company. So we're not talking about, gigantic refinery scale stuff.
Well, I promised equal time to new chemicals, and pyrolysis and advanced recycling does also touch upon new chemicals, but I think we've explored that topic pretty well. Let's go to the polymer exemption. EPA originally issued the polymer exemption under TSCA pre-Lautenberg in 1984, and there have been a few changes over time, but the exemption as it stands today allows companies to manufacture many types of polymers for industrial, commercial, and consumer use without notifying EPA in advance. Does the panel, I'd like to have people address whether you think the polymer exemption still adequately serves EPA's requirement under TSCA to assess risks to human health and the environment for new chemicals being manufactured or imported for the first time. Who'd like to kick it off?
I can start. Oh, Ross, you want to go?
Yeah, please go. I've been talking too much. I'm happy to cede the time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with the TSCA polymer exemption. And in short, the exemption was designed to sort of give a pass on risk assessment to those polymers that meet certain specific criteria. They need to be chemically inert, they need to be stable, they need to be essentially large molecules that are not bioavailable and not therefore expected to pose significant risks to human health and the environment. And so, as a result, if polymers meet those specific criteria, they're exempted from further review under Section 5. And so to that extent, we've heard about the resource limitations at EPA and the New Chemicals Program. Maintaining the polymer exemption allows the agency to focus their resources on the smaller molecules, the more mobile molecules that are, in fact, more likely to be a significant concern. Now, of course, any other additive or chemical that's in that plastic material would be subject to Section 5 review and wouldn't be eligible for the polymer exemption. So it doesn't give a pass to the smaller molecules, but just to those large polymers that are not expected to be reactive. Ross, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, only to sort of chime in with the ACC position on this. So we definitely support the polymer exemption. We think it functions as it should. It reduces barriers to market entry for lower risk substances. I mean, largely these are kind of low volume kind of things. It encourages safer chemistries, right? I mean, if you meet the exemption, then you're typically going to be a less risky chemistry. And frankly, it allows, and the point that's most important for us is it allows them to focus their resources on the things that they really need to in the Section 5 program. They already can't get through them. So adding more probably is not the best move at this point. So we obviously think that the polymer exemption has value here and is working as it should.
And I'll weigh in as well. So just we think that there's serious question about whether the polymer exemption is permitted under TSCA, and especially under the 2016 amendments to TSCA. So the statutory basis for the polymer exemption is Section 5H of TSCA, which says that EPA can exempt chemicals from the typical PMN process if it finds, I'm sorry, I'm actually looking at it now, if it finds that the conditions of use will not present any unreasonable risk of injury, including to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations. That was the language that was added in 2016, the reference to this susceptible subpopulations. So we don't think that EPA can find that even the limited set, if it is truly limited, set of polymers that are subject to the exemption, we don't think that EPA can say they will not present an unreasonable risk. And especially, we don't think that EPA can say that they will not present an unreasonable risk to the communities that live in the vicinity of places where the polymers are manufactured, processed, and disposed of. So even if polymers are less risky than monomers during use because they're more stable because of the large molecules and the greater stability, there still are emissions during manufacture and processing, and also releases during at the end of life stage as those chemicals break down in the environment and release and the additives and microplastics get released. So we think, especially when you take into account the concerns about fence line community exposures, there's no way that EPA could make a blanket statement that polymers will not present any unreasonable risk.
And just quickly, I just wanted to add on to what you just said, to say, when this polymer exemption was designed decades ago, certainly the EPA did not anticipate where we are now, where we're finding microplastics literally everywhere in our blood, in our brains, in our bodies, and placentas. And so it's a very different landscape. And I think that also kind of factors into this question of does this make sense now? And we would argue that it probably doesn't.
All right. Well, thank you all. I think we have time for one more question, and we did want to cover the topic of microplastics specifically in the session with respect to both new and existing chemicals. So in the time that we have remaining, microplastics are an emerging public health and environmental concern. Looking ahead, do you think EPA will and can address the potential formation of microplastics in TSCA existing chemical risk evaluations and in new chemical reviews?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think given what's happening at the EPA right now, I don't think anyone can predict what the agency will or won't be doing. But what I can tell you is the EPA should be looking at the potential formation of microplastics and in TSCA, existing and new chemical risk evaluations. I mean, to build on what I said in my opening statement, the term microplastic was first used 20 years ago, right? And to describe what was being found in the ocean. And today, scientists are finding microplastics in literally, nearly everywhere that they look. In our tap water, in our bottled water, there was, one study that found a liter of bottled water contained something on the order of, 240,000 microplastics. So basically, everyone, including the EPA, has been underestimating the level of exposure to plastics and the chemicals that we contain for many years because scientists and regulators have not really been considering the widespread exposure to microplastics. And we're now seeing mounting studies showing that microplastic exposure can have adverse impacts. I mean, there's obviously more science to be done here, and scientists are also trying to tease out whether the impacts are stemming from physical particles themselves or the chemicals that leach out of them or some combination thereof. And the current state of evidence suggests that the chemicals are probably the largest driver of toxicity, but the particles themselves can increase the toxicity. That's basically, if there's some kind of additive or synergistic effect. And so, it's clear that we certainly still need to learn a lot about microplastics and the hazards they pose to human and environmental health. But it's also clear that we know enough now to take action, and the regulators should be incorporating what we do know into toxic risk assessments and other regulatory action.
Jesse.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Renee. I won't comment on what EPA should or will do. I think you're right. It's hard to have a crystal ball for that. But certainly a big challenge in assessing microplastics, should the agency choose to take that on, is just the complicated and very much evolving science on the toxicity of microplastics. As a category of materials, they're very heterogeneous, right? They're made from different chemistries. There are a lot of different particle sizes and morphologies, all of which may contribute, as Renee mentioned, to the inherent toxic properties that they may have. So because of that difficulty in characterizing what the substance is and then what the effect is, they don't fit into the standard rubric of kind of hazard assessment and risk assessment under TSCA. And so, not to say that the agency couldn't choose to take on that challenge, but it certainly would be a challenge from a scientific perspective to make that assessment.
Eve, you had your hand up?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to, again, sort of tie this back to the statute itself. And I would say that EPA is legally required to consider the risks posed by exposure to microplastic, if in fact there is exposure from a chemical that's undergoing review. And that's because the statute requires risk assessment in Section 5 or risk evaluation in Section 6 to be based on the conditions of use. And the statute defines that in the definition section as the intended, known, or reasonably foreseen circumstances under which the substance is manufactured, processed, distributed, used, or disposed of. And so if it's known or reasonably foreseen that during manufacture or use or disposal, microplastics will be created through the degradation process or even just during the manufacturing process, then that's part of the conditions of use, and it's something that EPA has to include in the scope of the risk evaluation. I would also just throw in there that I recently learned that there still are a very large number of products that contain intentionally added microplastics. So several years ago, there was a provision of federal law that banned microplastics in a narrow set of products, largely in personal care products, certain personal care products. But there's still a host of products out there, including many that are regulated under TSCA, that like cleansers and cleaners that include intentionally added microplastics. So, for sure, that's something that, if that comes up in review, EPA to take into account.
Very good. Thank you. Ross, you can bring it home.
Yeah, and frankly, a fair amount of agreement. So, I mean, where Eve kind of just left off, I mean, TSCA focuses on risks from intended and reasonably foreseen uses, but not all degradation outcomes. And so, I mean, the challenge with microplastics is because they are, when does it become reasonably foreseen? And I think, I don't know that Eve or I has the right answer there either. I mean, like, we're still trying to figure this out. Because microplastic formation really depends on a lot of external factors like product use, disposal, things of that nature. And then the other place where I think, frankly, everybody agrees is, gosh, the science is still just so much needs to be developed there. We're putting $15 million as the global industry into trying to answer some of these questions on microplastics, and that's not remotely enough, right? I mean, and so, that is another challenge with sort of using TSCA for it at any time, really relatively soon, is that we just don't necessarily have, the best science really at this point. But this is what these are for, and certainly I'm sure we won't stop talking about it, and this area will evolve.
We hope you have enjoyed this rebroadcast of the Plastics Production, Use, and Recycling Key TSCA Considerations under TSCA from TSCA Reform 9 years later. The topics discussed are as timely today as they were in June. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.